Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to this week's teaching. I'm continuing our series on the ancestors, particularly those in what we call the Old Testament. And today we're going to take a look at a guy named David. David is a well-known character in the Old Testament. He is the most loved and revered, respected king in ancient Judaism. He has this wonderful tagline about him, a man after God's own heart. And he has some stories that are super familiar to us, which we'll get to. I'm taking a look particularly about how he had courage, because there are some things that he had great courage in. And then we're also going to take a look at a couple moments where he did not have a lot of courage when he really, really needed to muster it. So let's just jump into this thing. So David was the youngest son. And let me just say, there's this book, birth order book that came out many years ago that talks about how we're shaped by virtue of the number that we were in the sibling order. And it's got insights for what does it look like if you're an only child, what does it look like if you're the oldest child, a middle child, and the youngest child. I am the youngest of 4 children in my family of origin, and I can tell you there are some things that the youngest child understands when we get together. So David, I have a little bit of resonance with this guy because he was the youngest kid and he had a lot more siblings than I did. One of the things that you learn about David is this kid was scrappy, and there's a good reason for it. Especially back in that day and age, I imagine he had to scrap for everything he wanted. If there's a little food on the table, if he doesn't get in there and figure out how to deal with it and get his portion, maybe it's not coming that day. And he's constantly wrestling around with older brothers, which made him a pretty good, pretty scrappy. Again, he can handle his own, and had to live in an older world than he was. He knew what it was like to not have much of a voice because he was the youngest in the family and had to figure out how to overcome that with all the insecurities that brings with it. I could go on and on, but let's just jump into one of the most famous stories in David's life. It's one that is well known throughout the world. It's used in literature, and just the 2 words or the 3 words that describe this story, immediately everybody knows at least what it's talking about, even if they don't know the particulars of the story. And that story is David and Goliath. So David and Goliath is a story about the underdog who is taking on a literal giant. And there's interesting reading about this, about who this guy was, Goliath. And actually, I think a fascinating way to understand it comes from Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote a book called David and Goliath. And in that entire book, Malcolm Gladwell is talking about how underdogs, people who you wouldn't have expected to succeed, actually did succeed. And he has an interesting way of thinking about this particular text, seeing Goliath as a real deal guy who suffered with gigantism and some of the issues that came with that. And here you have David coming in to bring in and out to his brothers and whoever else on the front lines of war between the Jewish people and the Philistines. And the Philistines were just hanging out behind Goliath because he could take anybody down. And so David sees this, and he's scrappy. He doesn't know his own limitations. That's kind of part of the deal with the youngest borns or the youngest siblings. And he's looking at the cowardice, what he thinks is cowardice anyway, of all of his brothers and the Jewish army. And he's full of faith, and he says, what is going on here? What is your problem? The God that we serve is the real God, the one true God. Certainly, God is going to be with us in this battle. So what gives? And everybody just kind of hemmed and hawed, and it was very clear that everybody was terribly afraid. And so finally, David just kind of spoke up and took up the Philistines on their challenge. They were making an offer, which happened back in those days, where instead of everybody dying and getting into this terrible bloodshed, they would put out their greatest warrior, and whoever won the battle between each army's respective greatest warrior, they won the battle that day. So here's Goliath, undefeated. Nobody wants to take him on because they're going to get whipped. And David steps forward. He's going to do it. And who knows what's going on with the brothers' minds or anybody else? They're probably thinking, well, kid's going to die eventually anyway, so might as well be today. I don't know. So they load him up with all the armament and all this stuff, and David, takes his place on the field, and he's not quite a man yet, and so he can't quite handle all of the gear that's been thrown upon him, and he realizes he can't operate this way. There's no way he's going to be able to have any chance at all against Goliath if he's using the weaponry of somebody else. But he does know what he's good at, and he's full of faith, and knowing what he's good at and his faith gave him a courage that really was pronounced in this moment. And so he takes off all of the stuff, the swords, the shields, all that stuff, and basically he's just looking like the shepherd boy that he was, and the only thing he has in his hand is his sling. Now, if you do a little research on shepherd boys and their sling, you'll understand that this is a real weapon. That these young men and men, period, learn how to use these things with great accuracy and speed. And so David's thinking, I don't have a chance for a hand-to-hand battle with this guy, but maybe I got a chance with an air attack. And David knew that he could keep his distance from Goliath. He could outrun him. He could outpace him. And if he got just the right shot with God's help, then maybe he could even take him down. And that's exactly how the story goes. Goliath is expecting a hand-to-hand combat situation, and in comes David with the Air Force, with his sling and a stone. And he takes him out. And was God a part of that? Yeah, it kind of seems like it. In one way or another, if we go a Tom Ord kind of way, then sure, God was all over this thing. God was giving David the calm, the courage, the faith, the skill set, all this stuff works together, and the story ends where the underdog actually beats the giant. So when we look at this, that's a story of encouragement, especially today, because we feel like we are up against a giant, and we are. This giant is called COVID-19. And at times like this, we feel like we have nothing to do. We can't do anything to get around this thing. And that's exactly right. In fact, the ways that we have tried to take down enemies of the past doesn't quite work the same way with this one. So what are we doing? We're trying to be smart and courageous, using the wisdom of officials and doctors and collective wisdom to do the best thing we can do to fight this thing. And I hope you're doing it. And that is to use what we can to defeat this thing, which is our distancing, our doing things differently than we have before. And it requires courage, because if you're a normal human being, this has been a stressful time for you, and you've had anxiety, and you've wondered, how long is this going to go on? How long can I handle this? And that's totally natural, but have courage. This is the way we're going to get through this marathon event called the coronavirus. And so hang in there with that. And remember that giants get defeated. This is a global giant, and it's not going to win the day. There's going to be some loss. There's going to be economic loss. There's going to be life loss. We don't know exactly how it's going to change things for the long haul, but we know what we got to do. And I hope you're being smart about how to do that. So David gives us some courage as we're facing this giant today, and I hope you'll share in some of that from him, and have faith and pray, and just keep doing what you know you can do with what we know we're capable of doing, and we'll get to the end of this thing together. Well, there are a lot of stories with David and Goliath, or not just David and Goliath, but with David. Not only was he pretty good with a stone and a sling, but he was really good with a six string. He was actually quite famous for his musical capacity. When Saul became king, we think Saul probably had some kind of a mental health issue going on, where he would go into these tirades where he's unconsolable, except for one thing. David's guitar playing could come and save the day. And so David would, at Saul's request, come in and start jamming, and somehow that just helped Saul chill out, relax. Sometimes it didn't, and David had to run for his life because Saul would like throw spears at him and stuff, which, again, youngest kid, so he knows how to avoid spears and things being thrown at him, because that's what older siblings do on occasion. So he was well equipped for that, but he was a gifted musician. And that takes its own level of courage. I mean, imagine going into a literally hostile audience and doing the best you can in a performance. That's what David did. And you got to give the guy credit for that. Not only that, but he was apparently, I don't know if he was a gifted dancer, but he liked to dance. And there's one particular occasion, if you read through the accounts of his life in the Old Testament, you'll find that there's this one peculiar setting where he is leading a processional in worship. And we're not quite sure if he had any clothes on at all because he was so getting into this thing. Let's hope he had a fig leaf on at least. And his wife actually got mad at him for making a fool of himself with his dancing. I can relate to that. My wife has gotten on me on occasion for my dancing skills, if we can call it that. So anyway, he had the courage to dance even though he probably wasn't a good dancer at all. He was also a poet, and a lot of the Psalms, we're not exactly sure how many are really from his pen, but he is accredited with a lot of the Psalms in the Bible. And the beautiful thing about the Psalms, and this really speaks to David's fullness in the human experience, is a lot of the Psalms are not happy Psalms at all. I mean, you know the favorites, like the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That one, you hear this a lot at funerals. It gives us a lot of peace and comfort about a God leading us beside still waters and restoring our souls, making a table in the presence of our enemies, anointing our head with oil, and we're going to live in the house, Lord, forever, all that. Very, very comforting. But, there are other Psalms where David just flat out says what he's feeling, and he's not feeling positive things. He's mad, he's frustrated, he feels discouraged, and he's not afraid to let loose on God. And you think about the time that David lived in, that took great courage. And that day and age where they felt like the gods up in the sky somewhere were just watching what you were doing and you better not tick them off, for David to take the risk, to be honest in his prayers is really quite bold. And I hope that you will take the same kind of courageous risk, especially during this anxious time. God can take it. And God's love for you is bigger than your eloquence or lack thereof. So if you got nobody else to scream at and to yell at and to complain to, let her rip to God. Because God is big enough, God's ears are big enough to handle it. His love is not fragile, and so let her rip. Because sometimes just getting our angst off our chest and our frustration is exactly what we need to move forward toward health. So keep that in mind. So we got a very courageous David here, a guy who faces giants and doesn't back down, a guy who is willing to pick up his sixth string and play for an extremely hostile audience. We got a guy who's willing to write poetry that's deeply honest, even if it doesn't always paint himself or God in a good light. David was also a man of honor, and he had the courage to do the honorable thing. There was this moment, it's kind of a funny story, really. So King Saul is after him. King Saul is terribly threatened by David. David's a better warrior than he is. Everybody's talking about it. There's this saying out there that Saul killed his thousands of warriors, enemy warriors, but David killed his tens of thousands, and it drove Saul crazy. He was very intimidated by this one who was close with him. And so he put a price on his head, and David and his buddies were on the run a lot of the time in the wilderness in Judah. And so Saul would be after him. And on this one particular occasion, David and his mighty men, I know that sounds like a Monty Python thing, but that's kind of how the Bible talks about him. So David and his mighty men knew that they were being hunted and that Saul's army was really close at hand. So they found this cave and they decided to hide out deep in the recesses of this cave in the darkness. And so they're hiding in the cave in the darkness, and lo and behold, in comes Saul, King Saul, in all of his glory. And he is there for one purpose, to relieve himself in a way that requires greater privacy, if you're with me. And so all the guys are watching this. And I don't know how they didn't keep from laughing. But anyhow, David's men are saying to him, dude, this is your opportunity. This couldn't be any easier. Off with the guy's head. I mean, this is crazy. God is delivering this guy right into your hands. Let's take care of business while he's taking care of business. So David is considering this. He's seeing what's going on, but David refused to do it. And refused to do it because at that point he recognized that Saul was still the anointed king of Israel, that he was anointed by God to be king, and he wasn't going to take him down because he didn't feel like he was allowed to do that in his theology, and because it was dishonorable. And he felt like both things, even though Saul didn't deserve any honor at all, there was a different thing operating in David. Because David realized, at least in his better moments in life, that how we treat other people and how we react to other people isn't really about other people. It's about us. It's about who do we want to be. That's hard sometimes because there are people in our private lives, sometimes in our family, sometimes they're friends, co-workers, schoolmates, whatever. And we see their behavior and we look at what they are deserving of, and they do not deserve to be treated well. Sometimes it's with our politicians, sometimes with other government leaders. Fill in the blank. We all have a short list probably, of people that we can come up with that they did not deserve our respect. But how we treat other people isn't about what they deserve. It's about who we are. And as Jesus followers, as people of the way, we're called to something higher than what other people deserve. In fact, we do this because this is how God has treated us. We are not treated as we have deserved from God. We're treated favorably and gracefully because that's who God is. And so when you are frustrated during this time, maybe you thought you got to Costco early enough to buy your extra toilet paper or beans or whatever it is, and you find out you're 150 people away from the door, or your neighbor's being a jerk, or somebody's not paying attention to the rules, and you're frustrated and all that. Just remember, how you treat other people is not about the other person. It's about who you are. It doesn't mean that you're a doormat. It doesn't mean you don't stand up for what is right, but it does mean that you act in a Jesus kind of way, which still holds people accountable, but does it in a way that still affirms that God is love and that God is good, and that God also respects and loves the person that we're talking about and to. So be aware of that. Saul decided to do his business, and it could have gotten him killed. Lucky for him, there was a guy named David who had the courage to decide to not do what Saul deserved, but decided to live his life by who he was rather than what Saul deserved. Well, I want to turn our attention now to a couple chapters that aren't, it's not really about David's fame as much about his infamy. Then there are two kind of related chapters. One has to do with his son Absalom, who was his firstborn son who should have become king. And the other has to do with another son whose name was Solomon and where he came from. So let me tell you just a brief story. You've probably heard of this story too, because it also is really well known. I'm talking about, of course, David and Bathsheba. So this is a really, really apropos story for us to linger on for just a moment and see what happened to David, because remember who he is. Remember where he's come from. This is a guy full of faith, man after God's own heart, the poet who can express his feelings so well to God and other people, who is honorable and all this. And then we come across this scene with David and Bathsheba, and most people in the world, who read much anyway, or are culturally exposed, as soon as they hear those three words, David and Bathsheba, just like David and Goliath, they know what's coming. This is a story about a miss. This is a story about a broken marriage and death and deception. How did this happen? So this event, this season, this chapter of David's life with Bathsheba happened when kings go to war. There was a particular season for this. There was a wisdom to honor the season of the year in terms of getting your crops planted and in terms of taking care of your animals. And when some of those things were taken care of, that's when you went to war. And so you had more people ready to fight, and there were agreements along this line and all this. So anyway, this was a season of war. And remember, David was a warrior. He was the greatest warrior in the army for most of his days. But now he's up in years. And now he's made a wise decision that his presence is better needed on the throne than on the front lines. And so he stays home in his palace while his army goes off to war. So you just need to understand, this is David whose identity is deeply wrapped up in his capacity to fight. His understanding of himself as a military man runs deep. We know this runs deep with veterans today. And especially, if their experience was positive, their career, to step out of that and into civilian life is very, very difficult. David loved this kind of vital energy that he would get to display on the battlefield, and now he can't be in it. And I think it was throwing him for a loop. It's like he has this season now where he knows what he's supposed to do. He knows what he's been doing at times like this his whole life, and now he can't do it. And I wonder if some of us are kind of dealing with that right now. That we're in a season where things aren't the same, and we're not quite feeling ourselves. So David, just trying to figure out what to do while he's all home alone, walking around on his palace roof, and he looks down, and here's this woman who is taking a bath on top of her roof. Her name is Bathsheba. Now, there's a lot of speculation about, did Bathsheba know what time of day David was taking his walks, and was she trying to time this just right to get his attention because her husband was off to war, and maybe she was trying to pass the time too and was looking for some excitement. We don't know, but here's what I can tell you. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if she was throwing herself at him or not. The reality here is that David invited her to the palace. David the king. David the guy who held all the power over Israel. David the guy who had all the power over Bathsheba. And David invited her to his palace, to his room, and they had an affair. And so even though there's been a case made about, he was seduced by Bathsheba, it does not matter, because you had such a massive power imbalance between David and Bathsheba. David held all the cards here. So while we can, appreciate the complexities and all, just hear that David is blowing this thing, that David had the capacity to make a decision the other way, and he didn't. They had an affair. There was a child that came out of this. There was a cover-up necessary because all of a sudden David finds out that she's pregnant. She's married. Her husband's on the front line. So David calls the guy back on the front line, hoping to, get them to consummate their marriage all over again. And he won't do it because he's too honorable, the husband of Bathsheba, and doesn't feel like he should be having a good time when his friends and colleagues are on the front lines. David tries to sweeten the deal, but he just won't have anything to do with it. And so finally, David makes the call as the leader of the military and essentially calls for his death in a really pathetic way, and he dies. And so this kid is born. David brings her in, makes her his wife. The child is born, and he doesn't live long. He dies. Gets sick. David prays hard, tears his clothes and everything. And he dies. Just a lot of death, a lot of deception, a lot of things going around. They get pregnant again. And this time, Bathsheba is concerned about her well-being going deep into the future because everybody's kind of smelling what's going on around here. And I think she's kind of worried for her life and her future. And so she's inconsolable, and she cuts a deal with David which is also an odd deal for him to make. And the deal was simply this, that this son that they were going to have together, that he would become king of Israel. And David agreed to it. This kid's name was Solomon, and he became the king after David. Now remember, there's another son. His name's Absalom, who is the rightful heir to the throne. And as soon as David made known that Solomon was going to be king, guess what that did to Solomon? Yeah, that's a problem. In fact, eventually, Absalom is going to try to dethrone David, his father, the old-fashioned way, by killing him. We'll get to that in a minute. How is it that a guy like this, like David, who seems so sharp and courageous and with it and in touch with his whole self, how is it that he could find himself in this kind of a position? Well, we know from modern psychology and even our own Enneagram that we play so much with at CrossWalk, that when we're not at our strength, when we're not at our best, we find ourselves doing things that are not like us at our best, not like us at our strengths. In fact, there's even predictable ways within the Enneagram that we will likely go to when we're not feeling great and on top of the world. And I think David, not to excuse it, because David had the choice, and he had choices to make along this, because he knew he was in a funk. But what he did when he was in a funk mattered. And it's like he forgot or didn't pay attention to this much more important voice in his head that I know was there saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. That there had to be this thing in them. The Apostle Paul talks about this later on, centuries later, in one of his letters, that God uses our conscience to talk to us and say, don't go this path that you know is not right. He says it this way, that the law of God is written on our hearts. And I'm confident that there were massive things going on in David's heart and in his conscience that were saying, don't look, don't call her up, don't invite her over, don't go the next step, don't kill the husband, don't, etc., and on and on and on. I think the reality is when we are at a time when we're not our own, when we're not feeling strong, when we're anxious, when we feel weak, I think it's at that time that we need to pay the most attention to whose voices we're listening to. And unfortunately, I've seen it and experienced it all too often, where when we're in that kind of a funk, that seems to be, for some reason, sometimes the time when we're least likely to turn to God, to turn to our friends, to reach out for help, and yet it is the most important time for us to do so. I've had friends make terrible, terrible life decisions, and I've made a few whoppers of my own in my time. That when we felt threatened, when we felt just not ourselves in a funk, we just kind of made decisions shooting from the hip that weren't good for us, and it was not good for anybody around us. Certainly, I've heard multiple stories about people involved in affairs, and it's so common that they feel like their marriage is not healthy, and it probably isn't. And they feel like it's not going anywhere. They don't feel themselves. They don't feel affirmed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they find themselves in the company of somebody who feels just like they do. That's how it often happens. And all of a sudden, somebody starts shining some light on them, and they feel good about it. They feel alive in a way they hadn't felt alive for a while. And even though I know there are things in their head that are saying, don't go here, don't go here, don't go here, they go there. And it leads sometimes to some terrible decisions with enormous consequences. And so I guess my question for you is, knowing that we have this capacity in us, is how are you like David in that regard? And where are you right now? How are you feeling emotionally? Now, some of us, especially at this heightened anxiety season of coronavirus, we know we're not feeling ourselves. Nothing's the same. We don't just run out to the store. We're not getting together with our friends. We're feeling isolated, keyed up. Turn on the news and your blood pressure goes up immediately. And so I'm wondering how you're doing with that. And I would give you some advice right now, if you'll take it. And that is to first just be aware of what you're feeling. Sometimes just getting it out there is one of the most important things that we can do. Just to say, I am feeling anxious, or I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling restless. If you want to take it the next step, get yourself a journal or a piece of paper or just your keyboard on your computer or whatever, and just start talking about it. What do you feel anxious about? How is what's involved with that, and what is that leading to, and what behaviors are you seeing yourself do what you normally wouldn't do? Because sometimes just getting this stuff out on the table lets us address it, because now it is out on the table, and you don't want to get to that place like David was, where he had all this unreflected angst going on in him, all this stuff working within him that was not processed, not worked out well, and all of a sudden he becomes a time bomb. That's not what you want. And so I'm encouraging you to do the things you need to do for your own emotional health, for your sake and for the sake of those around you. Figure out your release valve. Make sure they're healthy release valves. Write this stuff out. Talk to people who you're sharing space with right now, either virtually or in your household, and just have the conversation. How is this making you feel? Deal with it together, and then try to do some things that are going to change your venue for a while. Play a game, get out some Yahtzee, work a puzzle if you haven't already. Don't watch a heavy movie. Watch something silly. Just because it's just going to help you. It's really good to find something to laugh at right now. And if you've been watching all serious stuff or whatever, or horror stuff or whatever, why don't you just take a chill from that and just spend a couple days on comedies and just have some fun with that and play together and just do that. And the final word is, if you know you're in that spot and you're already down the path to making some really bad decisions, I'm asking you to stop. I'm asking you to realize that this voice inside your head, this conscience thing, is real. And there's this old line from a course I used to teach many years ago, that when we try to discern that voice within us, a lot of times if we only listen to ourselves and we tell ourselves, "Well, I just know this is right," this is kind of a danger, by the way, of an unrooted spirituality. Is if we're not listening to any other spiritual teachers in our life, any people of wisdom in our life, we sometimes find ourselves into validating only the voice in our head, which is that well-formed voice that has been crafted in us over our whole life, formed from all of our experiences and cultural conditioning and education and all that stuff. And sometimes that voice, which is our own head, is flat out wrong. It's based on our ego. It's based on our cravings, which are not necessarily good. They're there. We can be honest about them, but fulfilling or satisfying some of those cravings in unhealthy ways, there's going to be a part of us that says, but that just feels so right. And I'm just telling you, there are some other ways to check yourself to see if what you're doing is right. And there's a handful of ways to do this. One is if you're thinking about heading down a path and you're wondering, is this just me thinking this is a good idea or not? Look in the biblical tradition and the Christian way. Does this thing line up with what Jesus would do? I know that's kind of cliche, but it's legit. Does this fit the way of Jesus? Is this something that Jesus would instruct his disciples to do? And the wisdom of our tradition, does this make sense? And how about trusted friends within our spiritual tradition who you look up to? And if I'm one of those voices, then reach out to me and I'll help you discern this stuff. And I'll help you know if I'm aware of any theological tradition or whatever. Hey, you know me, I'm a pretty open guy, so I'm reasonable, I think. But you need to ask people that you trust, does this seem wise? And you know what often happens is if we're going down that path, there's going to be a part of you that doesn't even want to take that step because you already know the answer to the question. And that needs to be what you listen to. So if you're in a danger zone already, and you know that you don't even want to ask the question because there's a part of you that already knows that what you're up to or what you're thinking about being up to is unhealthy, can I just tell you to stop? Can I tell you that you're on your way to a David and Bathsheba maneuver here, and that the consequences are terrible? The other story I want to talk about was Absalom. And David he may have been good at a bunch of things, but I'll tell you one thing he was terrible at was fatherhood. He was an awful father. Terrible. There's this line in the Bible where he's asking this question as if it's a rhetorical question. Absalom, Absalom, how is my son Absalom? If only he would have asked his son directly. But for whatever reason, he couldn't bring himself to do it. It was too full of himself, too into his own agenda, too full of pride, whatever. And his son had left the building. And his son was trying to kill him. And if only David would have paid attention to what holistic health looked like in his life and actually done something with that, maybe his own son wouldn't have tried to kill him. I'm wondering if you've got any Absaloms in your life, relationships you've neglected, people you've defamed, decisions that you wish you could turn back. I bet you do. I know I do. And I know it's work and painful work to get back to them. There's this word in the Bible called repentance. I am sure you've heard of it. A lot of times we kind of cringe with it because it's been used in some unhealthy ways perhaps, but it literally just means to turn around, to turn back. At least that's one way of thinking about it. And in a religious kind of way, it means to turn back to God. It means you're heading in one direction, you're going to do a 180 to turn back our thinking about it to God. There's another way to think about it, another interpretation, which I was reminded of in our Experiencing the Heart of Christianity course that features Marcus Borg's book, The Heart of Christianity. And in another frame, repentance is referred to as returning to the mind of God. Returning to the mind of God. I think that's a beautiful statement. And I hope that for all of us, this unwelcome sequester of sheltering in place will be a catalyst for us to return to the mind of God. That we might find ourselves centered, restored, that we would actually pursue health and well-being, especially with those that we love and with ourselves and with God. You know, there's a beautiful psalm that David wrote after he returned to the mind of God. He lost his mind with Bathsheba, no doubt about that, but he returned to the mind of God with the help of a prophet named Nathan. And in response to that experience, he wrote what we call Psalm 51. And it's this beautiful psalm that I hope that you'll read. In fact, I'm going to read it for you right now. Let me pull this up. Just don't mind me while I'm looking at my phone. Psalm 51 reads this way. Have mercy on me, O God, because of your unfailing love. Because of your great compassion, blot out the stain of my sins. Wash me clean from my guilt. Purify me from my sin. For I recognize my rebellion. It haunts me day and night. Against you and you alone have I sinned. I have done what is evil in your sight. You will be proved right in what you say, and your judgment against me is just. For I was born a sinner, yes, from the moment my mother conceived me. But you desire honesty from the womb, teaching me wisdom even there. Purify me from my sins, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Oh, give me back my joy again. You've broken me. Now let me rejoice. Don't keep looking at my sins. Recover the stain. Remove the stain of my guilt. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit within me. Do not banish me from your presence, and don't take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and make me willing to obey you. Then I will teach your ways to rebels, and they will return to you. Forgive me for shedding blood, O God, who saves. Then I will joyfully sing of your forgiveness. Unseal my lips, O Lord, that my mouth may praise you. You do not desire a sacrifice, or I would offer one. You do not want a burnt offering. The sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. You will not reject a broken and repentant heart, O God. So look with favor on Zion and help her. Rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, or we might say now, rebuild the walls of our country. Then you will be pleased with sacrifices offered in the right spirit, with burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will again be sacrificed on your altar. David ends with a statement of hope, not because of his strength and who he is, but because of what God can do. Then I hope the strength of who God is and what God can do in us will give you courage in the days ahead. Courage to face this giant we have together, a Goliath-sized problem called COVID-19. The courage to do what we need to do to stay healthy, the courage to face down even difficult emotions and be honest about them. And when we're in that place where we're losing our minds, to finally choose to return to the mind of God, where we will find grace and peace and strength. So may that be true of us. May it be true of you. Thanks for tuning in. I will see you next week. Thanks for coming. Bye.